you ever so much for joining us today. It's really appreciated for you signing up for the webinar. The webinar today, our title is Your Questionnaires Won't Save You. Discover the vendors most likely to reach you next. This is really it's conversation that Johnny and myself are going to be having. Johnny's from ThreatPlane, and I'll introduce you a bit more. But I speak to a lot of people regularly during the week, and they're busy looking at their vendors. And the reason or the reason, legislation or the regulation says you need to go and look at your vendors, you need to assess your vendors, is really to stop you ending up from supply chain compromise. And we find a lot of people going through the motions, but or those motions aren't necessarily going to achieve the desired outcomes because they're looking in the wrong place. So the idea of this webinar is to walk you through various stages of what goes on, also to introduce the concept of threat modeling. So it's like, where does my risk really lie? How do I find out? I've got all this data, I've got all this information. How do I sit there and actually understand what it means? And how do I present that information to senior management and my board? So that's the objective of today. You're very welcome afterwards to book sessions with us, have more chats. This is, it's a large topic, believe it or not, and there's plenty to explore. So let me move on and just get going with some housekeeping items to begin with. So webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will also be emailed to you afterwards. Probably tomorrow. We just tidy the video up a little bit and make sure it's got all the right sound bites in it. If you want, there's a Q&A button. Please submit your questions to the via the Q&A button, and we will get round to questions at the end. So moving on, quick intro from who I am. I'm Andrew Brown. I'm the CTO of Elasticito, and we provide end-to-end cyber risk assessments and manage compliance. These things tend to go hand in hand. I've been in the cyber industry for about the last 30 years. And then Johnny, CEO of ThreatPlane. Johnny, you want to say a couple of words?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So, hi, folks. I'm Johnny Tyers. I run ThreatPlane. My background in cyber goes back a long way. I started out on the other side as a hacker a long time ago now. Got caught when I was in my teens and was forced to choose the high road or the low road, and pursued a more sort of conventional career in software development. Spent a lot of my time working with government, protecting national secrets, and then into the commercial space. And now I'm here with ThreatPlane. We've been running nearly 10 years, and we are a threat modeling company. And I'll explain what that means a little bit later on.
Thank you ever so much. So moving on, let's just walk through some bits and pieces that, I'm starting at the beginning. So to give everybody an idea of where we should be going and what's important with vendors. So we always turn around and say, start off by classifying them. I don't mind how you classify them. You can go out and classify them as critical, high, medium, low, using whatever process that you want to do, okay? But then what happens is you need to sit here and you need to determine, why is this vendor critical to your organization? What is it that they actually provide to you, okay? And this doesn't have to be a cyber thing. It's what are they doing for you? What happens if they disappear? What happens if they're likely to fail? And then what we need to know, and this is generally left out when you're doing this, and unless you have this information, it's very hard to determine what risk the vendor presents to your organization. how does your vendor utilize or your organization utilize this vendor? And we're not just talking about SaaS vendors. They could be, a vendor that looks after all of your records. They could be a vendor that provides critical components to your manufacturing process, etc. We need to be able to look at it, and if we understand how they fit in and we contextualize them, okay, then we have a much better way to be able to look at the risk. And then what we want to do is we want to categorize them. Now, we've built some very good things around whereby we don't mind if you put them in a spreadsheet or what you've done with them, but literally we've started using AI and prompts, okay, to sit there and look at similar vendors and group them together. So we talk about a large scale SaaS vendor. A large scale SaaS vendor might be a Microsoft, a Google, a Salesforce, a Workday, or something like that. One of the large organizations that's not going to have a conversation with you. Small to medium enterprise SaaS vendors, not smaller guys. They're running applications. They might be more bespoke. We have product vendors, the likes of a Cisco, an Avanti, okay, a Citrix, and hardware vendors. You need to be able to sit there and run through this process and be able to do it. It's quite simple to put together once you've got the process in place. Then we move on to one of my favorite topics here, which is questionnaires. And let's look at what we're seeing and where we're seeing the trends here. A lot of organizations send out questionnaires to their vendors in the hope that they are going to fill these questionnaires in. And when I say, why would you do that? They say, well, we want to, check or validate that there's security controls in place. And we're like, okay, but we're seeing on the other side of it, companies are sitting there who answer these questionnaires, and what is happening is they can quite easily nowadays use AI to do it. And you might turn around and say, yes, but I asked for their policy documents to suit, as evidence. Well, AI will knock together a policy document for you quite quickly as well. And in addition, what happens is, in that regard, is how do you know that matches up to the actual what they've implemented? That's very time consuming on your part, very time consuming on the vendor's part, and we don't see it adding a lot of value. Yes, there's compliance and there's regulation to say that you need to do this, and we turn around and say, well, why don't you do a compliance check? So, has the person got a cyber essentials? Has they got, we're seeing cyber fundamentals come in the EU? Have they got a SOC 2? Do they have ISO? Map it to what is relevant, because that saves everybody time. Okay. You're going to see later on in this webinar that actually there's a lot more information we can gather from other places that is going to help us in this regard. So what we're sitting here doing, okay, is we're saying do a compliance check, choose the appropriate frameworks, look at the information you can actually do. I'm not saying don't ask questions. You'll see later on that there are some very valuable questions that you can ask, but those questions are going to be based on the information that you collect and the stuff that comes out of ThreatPlane. So, the next thing you need to be able to do is have a look at a vendor threat model. Okay. And that is understanding what is the threat that might be posed by your vendor. So if I go and sit there and say, well, okay, it's a SaaS vendor. Okay. I'm going to look at that vendor's public attack surface. Okay. That could be very relevant. What am I looking for? Well, I might be looking for things like vulnerabilities. Are they patched? What are they doing around it? But then if I move on to something like a product vendor, like an Avanti, a Citrix, a Cisco, or something like that, looking at my vendor's public attack surface doesn't tell me anything. I'm using that vendor's actual product. Okay, so I want to learn about known exploitable vulnerabilities. But what we're also seeing now is we're seeing a lot of move to SaaS or cloud applications, and we're now seeing plugins, APIs, AI being plugged in, okay? IT might not know about it. IT might have no visibility on it. Cyber most certainly has not got any idea as to who's connecting what together between different SaaS applications. Then we get into supply chain. So I sit here and I say, okay, I'm going to contract or bring this vendor into my ecosystem. And we say, well, what fourth parties do they bring with them? Do they have good or bad friends that they are introducing into this ecosystem? What visibility do we have? Because supply chain compromise is a big thing. So what is the one of the ways that the vendor that we're contracting with is most likely to be compromised? Well, probably his supply chain. So what do we know about their supply chain? Misconfigurations is something is huge. The biggest misconfiguration that we see is unmanaged devices being able to access SaaS applications. Stryker was a good example, okay, which was a US medical company who ended up with their Microsoft 365 environment compromised, and the threat actors used Intune to be able to delete all the devices. So, bit of a live off the land type thing once they'd managed to compromise it. A lot of the breaches we saw last year, okay, was due to actually unmanaged devices being able to access environments. So that's where we get around to device access and authentication, okay. Also, talk about misconfigurations, things like Salesforce experience sites, okay, is another example in that regard. So you have to then sit there and say, have I looked at all of these items here? We then move on and you can see what we're doing is we're building up quite a complex technical picture, but Johnny's going to introduce some additional items. So what I'd like to do then is we regularly go along, and when a major data breach happens with an organization, we sit here and say, okay, let's examine this. Let's see if all of the processes that we had in place and what we were doing would have been able to see this and whether we've got this covered. So one of the recent ones that hit was unfortunately, it was University of Nottingham that they were part of 100 plus other organizations that got hit by the same issue. And that was the PeopleSoft issue. So first off, I asked the question, okay, what happens if I'd been Nottingham University? Would I have been able to detect this? One, if I'd done a compliance check or sent someone some questionnaires, okay? And secondly, if I was busy monitoring this vendor of mine, would I have actually seen anything and what would I have actually been able to do? So if we look at it, okay, bit of a timeline here, and this we built from publicly information sources. Exfiltration begins around about the 27th of May. Okay, so we've got no CVE at that moment in time, just data's exfiltrating. Okay, and no one besides the people doing the exfiltration is aware of this. Round about the 9th of June, Nottingham detects the intrusion and takes the system offline, mainly because, in all probability, what happened is Shiny Hunters contacted the University of Nottingham and said, hey guys, we've managed to exfiltrate all your data. University then, on the 10th, turns around and says, yep, that it's actually our data that's floating around out there. So confirmation of what's going on. And then we get to the 11th of June, and Oracle says, oh, CVE, okay, yes, there is a vulnerability here. Let's do it. We use a tool called Black Kite, which is same as a bit site or a security scorecard, and they sat and they publish a focus tag for every organization in their 40 million companies that they have in their database, tagging everybody who has PeopleSoft to make the awareness out there, because obviously not everybody who had PeopleSoft ended up exposed immediately to this. So let's go back and let's just look at this. What possibly could University of Nottingham have done to actually detect this or look at it in advance? Well, the only type of thing that they could have done is turn around and said, well, it's a SaaS application, okay? What happens, or would I, if there's a vulnerability and someone gains access to it? And what we get down to around here is asking the question is, if we look at the log data associated with PeopleSoft for the University of Nottingham, would we have been able to detect anomaly data flows? And the answer is probably using something like a product called Volon, which enables us to detect data flows that flow in the wrong direction or in anomalies of data flows, which would maybe alert us around about the 9th or the 10th when this started happening. Okay. I'm sorry, around about the 27th when this started happening. And that is really, in this case, what could have been done around it from our perspective. There's other things that we see when we examine these type of data breaches to say, could we see them in the advance? Absolutely. You could see them happening or the potential for them to happen 2, 3, 4 months in advance. And this is where Johnny comes in, and I'm going to move off of Johnny now and say, okay, so if we take data that makes an appearance in this regard, okay, how would you handle it? What can you do with it by being able to threat model the whole of the supply chain and determine which vendors are the most risk and where the attention and the money should be spent? Johnny, over to you. You're on mute.
Thanks. Trust the technologist to get it wrong. Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for that. Um, yeah, we bring kind of threat modeling into this problem, and supply chain is particularly interesting because although threat modeling sounds like a technical concept, and obviously cybersecurity is underlying it all very technical, at the same time, why do we care about our supply chains at all? It's because they pose a risk to our business, and perhaps because external stakeholders, regulators, etc., are asking us to assess our supply chain. In other words, there's this deeply technical set of challenges on one part, and Andrew's already set out that there are things you can do. A lot of them are technical, KEVs, controls, etc., of a very technical nature, and we have to somehow marry this with with a very different world of our business exposure, our business risk, etc. And in threat modeling, what we're trying to do is bring these two worlds together so that there's a layer between them. What we've got here is a very straightforward view of a business risk at the top, and this is obviously a mocked-up example, a significant business impact from a cyber attack against a critical supplier. And there are generally different stages that you go through in order to vet and try and assess the criticality of your suppliers and what you can do to mitigate some of the risks they pose. Not quite in the order from the top, you can, as Andrew says, ask them to supply a security questionnaire, fill in a security questionnaire. These tend to be weak. On our experience, and I'm sure everyone here has seen this for themselves, who fills in the questionnaires on the supplier side often is driven by the sales team, obviously, who are trying to turn it around as quickly as possible. Is the information in the questionnaire? I mean, obviously, the supplier tests that it's accurate. This can change over time. A questionnaire typically is a snapshot in time. But also, is it detailed? It can't be that detailed because pulling detailed information out of a supplier for what their systems are can take a long time. After the questionnaire, you can go a step up. The next one down is actually two down in here. Request a copy of the supplier's policies for various areas. And this is better than a pure questionnaire. It starts to show to you that they have taken different aspects of their business seriously, whether it's data management, whether it's data retention, whether it's vulnerability management, et cetera, et cetera. But they are just policies. Although they're important, they may not reflect the reality on the ground. They may not cover fully where the different aspects of the risks are. And of course, they may give you policies that apply in some areas of their business, but not others. So there are gaps in there. You could look at externally audited requirements such as ISO 27001, etc. This is stronger again because they are audited by an auditor. It is not something which is something that your team have to build in-house with the limited expertise that they have. It is not something that can be, where information can be misrepresented either deliberately or not by a supplier. It is an externally auditable security requirement which is internationally recognized. That's a strong basis. However, none of these standards are perfect. They have different areas of coverage. They have different focuses. Some of them are very technical. Some of them focus only on risk management. And what we're really after when we think about our business risk from the perspective of our businesses is something a little bit more all round and something that actually captures probably a bit of all of those, whether it's ISO, cyber essentials, whether it's NIST, whether it's something else. And finally, at the bottom, and something I'm going to speak about here is how do we validate the presence of actual controls that are tied to specific risks that we've identified as coming from that supplier that impact our business. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So Andrew, if you go next slide for me, please. So first, let's just think about the notion of business risk. Security vendors talk a lot about risk. It is a bit of an overloaded word, I'd say, and a bit of an abused word in the security world. I've seen plenty of examples of vendors who will say, we address your security risks. And then you go, okay, so show me this list of risks that you're addressing or mitigating or whatever. And they say, yeah, here it is. And here's a vulnerabilities list. Or it's a list of CSS and CSP shortcomings in your web application, or it's a load of cloud misconfigurations. Those are problems, sure, but they're not risks. When we think about risks, we're thinking purely about the business risks. And as you can see here, they are business themed, they're not technical themes. And that's the core pinnacle of this whole approach. Your management team, and perhaps you yourself, are already thinking about the issues here. Revenue, reputation, and reputation, by the way, could mean in the marketplace, it could mean with your employees, your customers, your supply chain, or government bodies and trade bodies, regulators, etc. Operations, so the operations to deliver your service to your customers primarily, but of course other critical business operations fit into that as well. And finally, compliance. And we call this the rock of risk. This is a trademarked ThreatPlane framework. Hopefully the background image makes sense with the rock there. But we find, I mean, many businesses have their own way of categorizing risk, but where that is lacking or where it's not quite suitable for cyber, we found over the years this is a really useful way of just thinking about what themes are we aiming for when we even think about supply chain risk, or indeed risk of our internal systems. Next slide, please, Andrew, if you may. So what we see in most businesses, and you may well relate to this yourself, you may see this where you work, is this kind of chasm that I've already articulated, technology on one side and what I'm just going to call business on the other, business issues on the other. And it's kind of represented here is that at the top level, at the senior leadership level and board level, they are worried about these business issues, whether it's revenue, reputation, operations, compliance, whether there's a different set of language around that. And that typically takes the form of a top level spreadsheet with an organizational risk register that's updated annually, maybe quarterly, but it's a coarse-grained view of at the top level where are the corporate risks. And at the bottom, as you see here, the actual gubbins of security, the detail of it is detailed. It is technical. It is about monitoring and identity. It's about access control. It's about vulnerability management. It's about incident response, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these technical concerns. And the big problem that we see time and again, and which I've experienced in my career professionally, and even from my hacking days, as a teenager, I could start to see this gap where people just didn't understand what they were protecting or didn't understand how to protect them, is this essential chasm between technology and business. And there's this missing layer. So if you go next slide, Andrew. What we aim to do is insert the threat model in the middle. And what the threat model aims to achieve is exactly this, joining up. So having the technical depth that technologists can understand what needs to be done, but also understanding why. And the why, of course, is about the risk. And from the business angle, it's about seeing what we need to address in risk terms. So it is addressing the why, and it's tracking the what. Are we on course to deliver the controls that we expect to in order to mitigate the risk that we anticipate? Are we looking at the risks enough? You know, are we addressing the wrong risks? There are plenty of examples of organizations that spend lots of money addressing risks that are actually already addressed by compensating controls without focusing on the risks that really matter. You know, that system under the desk in the corner of an office, which is actually part of the critical path for your revenue collection, for example, or your sales process, or your marketing processes that bring leads into the business, which is how it continues to operate as a going concern. or it might be in a manufacturing and operational sense where these critical systems are. Are these risks being captured and managed properly? Because at the end of the day, this is a prioritization exercise. At the top, senior leadership set priorities through the budgets that they set, through the strategy that they articulate. At the bottom, those priorities become reality in terms of implemented controls and implemented protections in the business. But we need this translation layer so that both sides are singing from the same hymn sheet, so that they both understand where the risks are and where they aren't, just as importantly, and which controls are going to effectively address those risks and which controls aren't. Next slide, please, Andrew. One of the biggest things that we find, particularly when speaking about threat modeling, you may have heard about threat modeling already and heard that it's a very technical process and that it's very detailed and it can take months. We have clients that we've worked with in the past where they will build their own threat model with an in-house team and it takes 6 months in extreme examples. So what also needs to come with this is a consistent process that can be used to put together this material and deliver it. And the consistency is really important for a few reasons. Number one is you need to be able to deliver the process, to conduct your assessment on day one, and then conduct it next quarter. Or indeed, I mean, in the world that we're moving to in some sectors, we're moving to something more like a continuous compliance regime, where actually we need to be running this process on an ongoing basis. This is absolutely where we're headed. But the point is consistency, so that the risk doesn't change for no reason, just because a different analyst, for example, has run the process, but also that the process reliably brings in all the aspects that we need to make an informed decision about where the risk is and what do we do next in terms of mitigations. So as you can see here, we start with risk assessment, that business risk picture that we just talked about. We include a technical assessment of what, in this case, our suppliers are offering to us. And although it may actually stem beyond technology to, what resources they're giving us in terms of services they're providing, it may even be hardware that they're deploying into our premises, not just SaaS suppliers, but an assessment of what that is and where it is and how it's configured. Moving on to a threat assessment, looking at the security side of that, where are the threat vectors? What are the different ways that attackers could weave their way into this system or this supplier or this business process that the supplier is a part of in order to attack our business, or in order to, at least to have a negative impact on our business. And then finally, mitigations, a methodical way of looking at how do we think about controls, how do we measure the effectiveness of controls, and how do we consistently make decisions around the right controls to deploy. As you can see at the bottom there, I mean, when we do this in our sort of consultancy team, every engagement that we deliver is 4 weeks, regardless of complexity. And I only highlight that to say that it is possible to get to that place. I mean, we have some customers where we've got them to a place where there's a threat model being delivered every week. So either a risk assessment being updated as a system evolves every week because it's a fast-moving product line, or because actually there are lots of systems in the business and that are going through change control and technical governance and security governance, and that's the cadence that they're operating at. So you can get to a point where you have this process that is actually quite lean and is easy to execute. And because you're executing it regularly, it's well understood by your teams in the business, which is obviously a critical part of this. They need to be able to competently execute all this. And this is something that we help customers build and operate. So I've talked a lot about threat models. I need to talk about what actually is a threat model to sort of lift the veil a bit. Thank you, Andrew. So we use a triangle to kind of illustrate this, and a triangle very much for a good reason. We start with risk at the top. We move down to suppliers, threats, and controls. And the risks are always small in number, big in significance, of course, but they are small in number. The business usually has a good idea, whether explicitly and documented or whether not, about actually compliance is our biggest risk. And in some sectors, that would actually be the key thing. In some others, it might be operations are our biggest risk, because operationally, that's what we stand on. If we lose operations, revenue and reputation, etc., will be fast following. In some sectors, it's actually revenue. Ultimately, as businesses, if we are private businesses, revenue is king. But sometimes things precede that. Sometimes it is explicitly the primary goal. And sometimes reputation is the most important risk, and there are other aspects to that as well. But whatever they are, they tend to be small in number and understood in the business in terms of their relative priority, relative criticality. And generally, all of those categories will apply in different ways. And then from there, we look at the larger array of suppliers which feed into the business processes and the systems that we operate and how we operate as a business and how those suppliers integrate with those. And then there's a larger number of threat vectors, so ways in which attackers could exploit either the supplier or the way that we use the supplier's products or some other permutation. And then finally, controls, which tend to be a huge category, as I'm sure many of you are aware. You can deploy hundreds of potential controls in your business and still not address all the risk. Controls is a huge topic, and why, for us, prioritizing the right controls is so important, because we all have limited time, we all have limited budgets. Spending that on the most effective controls that will provably address the risk is the most important and the name of the game. So let's start with risk at the top, and I'm just going to tease apart each of these categories very briefly for you. So next slide, please, Andrew. With risks, we take a very simplistic approach. Simple is the best we find because it helps with the communication of this. Good communication helps to keep everyone on side. If everyone is on side, you'll win support from others in your business, both upstairs in terms of the financial director, in terms of operations director, etc., but also further down when you're coming to think about the controls that you implement, asking people to endure disruption as you implement controls, keeping them on side is important too in order to allow for smooth delivery of digital transformation and organizational change, which enhances security. So for risk, what we do is we split it up into two very simple categories: the data that we hold, or rather the data that our suppliers hold in this context, and the services that are being provided. So those are the two categories, very, very straightforward. One is about data loss, data retention, and obviously part of that conversation is regulated, but part of it is about actually data that's sensitive to us, maybe for commercial reasons. It might be intellectual property. It might be customer data that gotten into the wrong hands causes a reputational problem as well as a compliance problem if it leaks out onto the dark web, as with PeopleSoft's example earlier. Or it might be, to take a very different example, highly sensitive data owned by the customer, flight plans for, a military project, to take another well-known example out west. And then services is more about operations. So it's about any service which is delivered and is connected to our business operations. So is that service available? Is that service being subverted? Is it being degraded, or has it been taken offline? And of course, it may not just be a technical service. We might be talking about a customer service desk with people that need to be able to man phones. It might be a sales force that's going out and having meetings, booking meetings, finding leads, etc. And how do they operate? It might be in our operations department or even our compliance department. So one example of a service oft forgotten is something like audit, which is critical for compliance reasons in some sectors. If we don't have good audit trails of certain activities or certain activities that our customers are doing, that can be a big problem for our business going forward. So we split up risk into data and services as a nice, simple, top-level way of understanding what's at stake and then derive risks from that. And typically, as you'll see in a minute, actually, if you jump to the next slide, Andrew, I think we've got an example of this. Yeah, so this is kind of what you end up with. So we tend to split risks along the well-known CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability triangle. And so for each of those services, you can see here, these are screenshots from our platform of previous engagements with real customers. It might be CRM data, it might be data around accounts, it might be data around activity history, for example, in a retail context. It might be data around customer accounts if you're a SaaS platform and you're thinking about customer accounts that they've created themselves and maintain themselves. It might be things like training data. So along the bottom there, things like training data for AI models is one that we did some time ago, and whether there's actually significant risk attached to that. And one of the interesting things that came out of that engagement, but which we've seen time and time again, is the time factor. So you'll see with some of these, we delineate small impact and large impact. So if training data is not available for an hour, when do you retrain? How often do you retrain? It may not actually be that important. But if your data is unavailable for a month or for a quarter, and actually you're missing training cycles because of that, that's a very different risk. And so the way that you mitigate and manage that is very different. And there are some other examples there of different risks. Let's step on, so I'm mindful of the time. After risks comes suppliers. And I think if we go straight to the next slide, Andrew, with suppliers, this is an inventory question. And typically when we're working with customers, we're working partly with internal systems and with supply chains. And the good news with supply chains is that there is at least document trails of the suppliers you're working with in commercial terms, if nothing else. And so you should be able to get a handle on the suppliers that you're using for example, cloud compute and data storage. And some of these will be large suppliers that are handling significant data sets. So we've got Salesforce here. They might be handling marketing and sales and CRM data for your organization as a whole. That data set could run to very large. Some of them might be quite small. So some of the examples here might be more like a backup solution, which is only targeted at a particular system, which is in the corner. It's not core to core operations. So understanding who these suppliers are and where they integrate into your systems is really important. And again, that's a big part of what we help with. That consistent process that I showed you earlier, one key part of that is technical assessment, which is about understanding for a given area of the business who these suppliers are, how they interlink into processes, and that connection to risks, so data and services. Once we've understood what that, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, once we've understood what that supplier picture is,
Right.
the next stage, that's right, is threats, which is typically where SMEs like ourselves come into the picture to help you understand what the threat vectors against those suppliers are. So if you jump one more slide, here's just a sort of cutout example from a case study. And actually, this is a good example because there are numerous suppliers in this, but you can already see, I mean, we use, if you've done any threat modeling before, you might be familiar with the STRIDE framework, which is one that we refer to often as a way of doing threat discovery, amongst others. But all of these threats are effectively scenarios. An attacker could do X in order to do Y. They could impersonate users that come from your supplier. They could steal a laptop of one of your supplier's employees that they've left on a train, right? And then immediately we're thinking, is the laptop encrypted? Is there access controls? Hold on, we'll get to that. But all of these are scenarios that could occur against your internal systems, against your employees, or against your suppliers. And these are what collectively we call threats. And you can see some numbered boxes to the left there. When we think about threat vectors, we're immediately thinking, where is the connection back to that ultimate theme of business risk? So that top one, for example, impersonate GTM users in order to read data. Right, what is that data? What systems does that impact? And ultimately, that will bubble up to a risk, which is the revenue, reputation, operations, compliance themes that we talked about before. That's what we're aiming at, because then we can take a technical threat like this and immediately understand and present it to a non-technical stakeholder, for example, immediately understand, right, I can see why that's important because it affects a critical operation. That second threat there, you can see the number is in gray because 16 out of 100, by the way, 16 is a low risk. We can immediately understand, yeah, that is a threat as well. It's totally valid. It's actually against the same system or the same supplier. However, it's lower risk. So we don't actually need to spend as much on the controls there. And you can see the sort of varying color of the threats beneath that. After going through the threats, which is kind of the sort of technical stage that usually the security people are doing. Next slide, please, Andrew. We look at controls, and controls are, in the context of threat modeling, controls are any lever you can pull to either prevent, mitigate, detect, or respond to a threat which poses a risk to your business. So it's quite a broad definition. Downstream, if you jump to the next slide, we've just got a couple of examples here. Usually they are technical controls. Most of these in this list are technical. There's PIM, there's MFA and pass keys, there's TLS 1.2, encryption of user sessions. All of these are quite technical concepts. But because they're connected back up through that triangular stack to business risk, we now understand how important it is. You'll also notice some of these are not purely technical controls. Some of them are, they're non-technical. They entail a business process. That top one, PIM, is a technical product that lives in the Azure space. You might well know it better as PAM, Privileged Access Management. PIM is the sort of Azure iteration of that. But of course, it's not just deploying a technical product there. It's understanding, right, well, what's the business process around how we grant access? How do we define who has access to that? Is there an approval chain? All those sorts of things, which steps very much into core business. You'll also notice on the right-hand side, what we do is measure control effectiveness. So we start to say, look, across all the places where this control could be an option to deploy, across all of the various risks in your business, tally back up to revenue risks, revenue, reputation, operations, compliance, as we said before. This is where that control, gives you biggest bang for buck. And as you can see here, there's a nice ordering that is fully evidence and data backed that allows you to bubble up to the top. So if you bring all that together, next slide, please, Andrew, you come together as a sort of fully integrated threat model with, in this case, a diagram at the top, a nice summary of risks further down. And if you were to drill into any of those risks, you start to understand, right, threats and controls. And of course, those controls, because they're now prioritized in terms of effectiveness, you're now in a position where you can direct technical teams, for example, to say, these are the controls we need to implement. And these are the things we need to ask of our suppliers. So for supply chain, although this looks at internal systems, it always includes a supply chain angle. The majority of things that we look at entail supply chain just by the nature of modern systems. And the way that this kind of plays into supply chain is critical, because now we have, number one is that we have specific questions we can ask of our suppliers, or that we can cross-reference against, for example, their NIST assessment or their Cyber Essentials paperwork to say, right, are you doing network segmentation to the appropriate level? Are you doing MFA authentication? Are you doing encryption of your client devices, et cetera, et cetera? So we've got specific things that we can dive into the compliance documentation or their documentation to say. There's also an opportunity to validate these controls. So, with evidence that they provide, or with controls validation that we do on our side. But finally, and I think most crucially, is that we can now understand these suppliers pose a risk to their business. We are entrusting them. We have a commercial relationship with them in most cases, but they do pose a risk to our business. Now, this allows us to wargame the different scenarios where those suppliers where that risk could come in, where those suppliers could be compromised themselves, where they could suffer an outage and it's more of an operational and resilience problem. And how do we manage that risk internally? How do we respond to it? How do we, what are the notification requirements about it? How can we adopt controls internally that actually mitigate that risk, even if we're still going to suffer impact? Can we limit the impact? Are there backups that we can put in place, whatever that means, et cetera? So it starts to get the whole business thinking about where that risk is, driven by that North Star of business risk, but actually in detailed terms, wargaming what those scenarios are. So that
I
is
think,
threat
Johnny, on
modeling.
this one, if just to go back to the example that we had around PeopleSoft, we've now taken the whole process and we've got a model. So what happens is when we go and analyze and look at something like that PeopleSoft breach, and we analyze what we've got, and we say, okay, maybe we wouldn't have caught that. Maybe we wouldn't have seen it. Maybe we didn't identify the risk. What is missing out of our model? What have we left out? And that means that over time, what we're able to do is actually improve our model and make everything more robust. And it also enables us to evolve as threats evolve within our environment. Is that something, I mean, how often would you sort of suggest that this be visited? Sort of quarterly at the moment, or, when we identify new sort of, stuff from the analysis we've done over that quarter?
So if you take that slide that we had before, the leadership team at the top, the technology at the bottom, with the threat models interlinking the two, the clients of ours that make this a real success and that that really win because they are able to deploy controls effectively, etc. They make this a linchpin of their core technical governance. So what that means is that any system that goes live, any system that undergoes major change, and you may already have processes in place that govern this for various indicators. What they do is they put threat modeling at the core. Over time, they introduce threat modeling as the core of the security aspect of that. And of course, a lot of this touches onto operational resilience as well. So it tends to have a part to play there in BCDR. So that's kind of the end game. for many of them, because what they find is, as we've said, a consistent lean process actually becomes quicker over time because more of the organization understands it, and it's a muscle which is being exercised regularly. So rather than it being, I mean, when organizations start, often it might be a one-off exercise or an annual exercise, and that absolutely has value because it will highlight things that you didn't see before, and it will give you this data that we've just seen on controls effectiveness, and where suppliers fit into the picture, and sometimes highlight opportunities, really quick wins, actually, in terms of mitigating risk that is, posed by a supplier. But over time, that quickly translates to, let's try and do this regularly, because actually the value of these is to keep them up to date. And it means that the reference point for your corporate risk register, and for your senior stakeholders, or the reference point even for your technology teams who need to see the detail, becomes these models, because this becomes the shared hymn sheet. It means that rather than having a whole sprawl of different documents tracking what are ultimately the same metrics, risk, controls, and the stuff in the middle, the assets and the threats, you're starting to bring this into a single model that then you can hang place into different processes in your business and hang other bits of documentation off. For example, there's an opportunity to map your compliance metrics into the controls that are defined in threat models, for example. So
Okay, so from this, really where we end up is we then end up with a much more accurate picture of what we need to monitor, how we need to alert, workflows that we can actually put in place for remediation. Okay. And that really brings the whole, full circle together. So it brings the whole of our process that we're doing around avoiding supply chain compromise to sort of board level, being able to let us, talk about it and understand it, and also get buy-in from the top so that we can show how we've done it. And it's also, instead of it just being a sort of piece of paper and a couple of reports, by actually doing this whole threat modeling, it's forced us to think the whole process through and put in checks and balances. So, I think where we get to now is it's a bit of question time from the audience. So, let's go and see what we happen to have by way of questions that we've got floating around. So first off, a supplier of ours passed all compliance frameworks checks, but we don't know who their suppliers are. That's the fourth parties and the visibility of fourth party risk. Okay. How would you bring that in the fourth party risk? Would you start off with the fourth party risk? Do you think it's important to begin with, or how would you bring that fourth party risk into the model?
yeah, so we are always starting from the perspective of risk, and of course that risk is the risk to our business. So whether fourth party is important or not depends on our understanding of that supplier's delivery model and how important fourth parties are to those, and then how that impinges on ultimately what is risk to our business. So that would kind of determine that priority factor for me. The key is always understanding to start with, what is our risk, where does this supplier entail into our business, because that's where we're going to be. The most immediate levers we can pull in terms of protecting ourselves are usually in our business. And then secondarily, it's to go to suppliers and place a burden on them, either on them, third party or fourth party and down the chain, to enact certain controls or to meet certain requirements, SLAs, etc. I hope that answers the question. But I mean, absolutely, in principle, it can be modelled, and where it needs to be, it should be. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. If we look at another question we've got here, how can we accelerate our vendor security review process to prevent onboarding delays while maintaining robust risk standards? I think while we happen to have this process in place, okay, what we can see is how do we improve this? How do we not leave things out? I think what we're able to do with this process now is it sits here and it means that we're not doing things that are unnecessary. Laborious, long questionnaires, laborious assessments. If it's not needed, we're taking the actual threats or the risks that those vendors pose, okay, and we're just drilling down to the core, and we now know what the core is that they actually are doing and delivering to the business, so we can drill down and answer this onboarding and get through the review process, I think, a lot quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one thing I'd add is that we, we would adopt a similar process for internal systems, and you saw that process diagram earlier. We aim to make it lean and consistent, and because it's lean and consistent, the whole business is more confident about using it. So, although there will always be different considerations for external vendors that relate to purchasing, commercials, etc., the the risk assessment part of that process can actually be quite closely aligned to how we would do it for internal system change anyway. And that is hugely powerful because it kind of means that actually we know that we're starting to apply the same standards to that supplier chain, supply chain, as we would do to internal systems in terms of measuring that risk, in terms of understanding its place. But again, it is really important to be clear on where that supplier fits in your business and therefore the risk that they pose to it. Even when you're going through that vendor selection process, because of course that will equip you very, very well for how resilient these folks need to be, how much do we need to scrutinize the fourth party, etc., supply chain, and so on.
And if we, some other of these questions are about, how do we move from things like static point in time to continuous assessment without drowning in alerts? Okay. I think that by doing the actual threat modeling here and understanding what alerts you need, what alerts are important, what signals that you're going to get out of it, okay, it really is going to help you stop drowning in alerts because you're not just alerting on everything.
Absolutely. Alerting, I mean, I talked about controls being levers to prevent, mitigate, respond, and detect threats. And detection is a big part, has become a big part of our threat modeling over the years in terms of the benefit that it brings. Detection continues to be the weak point in most organizations. I mean, that PeopleSoft example is a great example where, it was months of dwell time before, at least I think it was months of dwell time before, Nottingham University made the discovery. And as you said, that may well have been triggered by the threat actor themselves. And what we see time and time again is that the attacks that make the press, the well-known ones of last year and long before, dwell time is an important factor where the attacker has they get through the front door, they're able to lay low, laterally move, and plan their next steps without disruption from the defenders. And of course, one of the themes that boils away in security circles is how exhausted the average SOC is, the average security operations center is, and how burdened their analysts are because they're drowning in alerts, exactly as you say. Because we're taking these detections and they're part of the controls that sit within the threat model, it's all linked to risk and those business imperatives, just like everything else. And I talked before about simplicity being the key. Simplicity in alerting is just as important. And because all of the alerts are, we aim to make them simple in terms of their number and their complexity, but also because they are linked to that ultimate business risk, it makes it very clear which ones are actually driving value in terms of if this goes off, it's a high fidelity indicator of an important, risk event versus ones which are actually not driving value. They're ones that might fire off constantly and actually, be an indicator of a low risk event. And it may or may not be important, but that's kind of for every organization to define. But now you've got the data to understand where it sits in terms of how much priority it causes, how much priority it deserves even, and therefore what the response playbook is and how much effort should be devoted to that.
Johnny, thank you ever so much. It's been a Great session. I think we've had
Thank
an
you.
interesting conversation. If anybody wants to dig further, have a one-on-one, you're very welcome to reach out to either myself or Johnny at ThreatPlane or Elasticito. And we're very willing to have further conversations, show you how this could assist and help your business. So really appreciate it. And yes, absolutely. If you want to have a look at the platform, we'll set up some time. We'll do a platform run through with you, answer your
Yeah.
specific questions. So really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll get to see you soon. Thanks,
Thank
Johnny.
you very much.